This is the second element, substantial participation in a public project. What I want to do, I kind of want to break these down into two separate elements. So let's start with substantial participation. What does that mean? Well, the case law is fairly clear, and the operative word is fairly. Substantial participation means that the public entity planned, approved, constructed, operated, or otherwise was involved, read substantially, in a public project or activity for public use or benefit. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, if the government did nothing, there's no inverse condemnation. Now we'll see that that idea gets fairly nuanced in some of these cases, but you need to remember there has to be substantial participation, and that could mean that the government was doing something and then they stopped, right? But if the government never did anything, there's no argument that there's substantially participated. There's possible inverse condemnation if the entity accepted and approved a public project like a roadway. Cases are clear about that, but again, you need to have substantial participation. And I'll speak just very briefly about another case that I was involved in where we represented plaintiffs where there was a very large flood caused by the failure of a levee. We sued a bunch of public entities and said, you know, y'all are responsible for what happened. One of the entities came back and said, look, we had nothing to do with this. You know, we were never involved. We had no involvement, no substantial participation. That's clear as day. And we fought about that in the court, but ultimately the court let them out and said, look, there's no, plaintiffs, there's no evidence of any substantial participation in the project by this entity, and therefore they're not liable in inverse condemnation. That was successful for that defendant, and they were let out of the case. So let's now talk about public project. Well, what does that mean? Well, importantly, it also means government activity for public use or benefit, right? So the case law defines this as, quote, a use which concerns the whole community. So when I look at that, this is what I see. I don't see a set definition, right? I see that there's a certain, there's a broad definition with room for interpretation, and I would say room for discretion as to what constitutes a public project, what constitutes a public use. And that's where you see a lot of these cases are fought over. Because what happens is, it's ultimately a question of law. And under Civil Code, Code of Civil Procedure 1260.040, it could be decided under that provision, which reads, quote, if there's a dispute between plaintiff and defendant over an evidentiary or other legal issue affecting the determination of compensation, either party may move the court for a ruling on the issue. So again, you'll see this fight in these types of cases, whether or not the activity of the entity was done for a public use or a public project. Now, it's a question of law, even if it involves questions of fact. The case law is clear about that. The limitation, however, is that the public use must be connected to the damage, right? You need to have a causal connection between the two.